What if the real danger isn't clueless people, but smart minds who blindly follow the crowd? What if the biggest threat isn't an obvious villain, but good people who stop thinking right when it matters most? Dietrich Bonhoeffer called this stupidity, but he didn't mean lack of intelligence. He meant something more unsettling, the choice to surrender our thinking because it feels easier, safer, or more comfortable. You see it every day. Smart people sharing lies they never checked, crowds uniting around half-truths because it feels good to belong, headlines sparking outrage before anyone asks, "Is this true?" It's not a problem of education or IQ. It's what happens when certainty replaces curiosity, when fear turns independent minds into echo chambers. Carl Jung once warned, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." And in that avoidance, even the brightest minds can become instruments of destruction, convinced they're doing good while they march alongside everyone else. That's what Bonhoeffer saw unfold in Germany, and what we risk repeating if we don't learn to think carefully when the world demands quick, emotional reactions. So what does it mean to stand against the quiet pull of conformity? And how can we protect ourselves from surrendering our minds when it matters most? Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born into a family where ideas mattered. His father, a renowned psychiatrist, and his mother, an educator, raised him in a home alive with debate and reflection. From an early age, he believed knowledge was the shield that protected people from cruelty and injustice. Yet, as the 1930s unfolded, he watched his homeland slip into a darkness that no book or classroom had prepared him for. What shocked him wasn't just the rise of a brutal regime, but the speed with which friends, neighbors, and respected figures traded thoughtful discussion for blind allegiance. The professors who once championed nuance began repeating party slogans. Religious leaders who had preached compassion turned sermons into propaganda. Ordinary families, some he knew personally, suddenly welcomed ideas they would have found unthinkable just years before. Bonhoeffer realized this wasn't a story of ignorance overtaking society. It was the unsettling reality of smart, educated people choosing to stop thinking when thinking became uncomfortable or dangerous. Carl Jung's words ring true here. Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, morphine, or idealism. And in Bonhoeffer's Germany, it was the addiction to certainty and belonging that proved most lethal. He wrote from prison that, "Against stupidity, we are defenseless, not because people lacked brains, but because once they surrendered their judgment to collective fervor, they became incapable of seeing reason." He understood that when fear and pressure rise, even well-meaning individuals look for safety in numbers, echoing ideas that offer a sense of control. The more people repeated those ideas together, the more confident they became, even as those ideas grew more extreme. Bonhoeffer recognized that in this environment, slogans replaced thought, crowds replaced conscience, and moral clarity was quietly suffocated. These observations forced him to abandon his youthful faith in education as a cure-all. He came to see courage as the missing ingredient. Without it, knowledge alone could not protect a society from sliding into horror. He chose resistance, knowing it could cost him his life, because he refused to trade his mind for the comfort of conformity. His final writings weren't just laments about his time. They were warnings meant for anyone in any era who might face the temptation to stay silent when truth becomes inconvenient. What Bonhoeffer saw wasn't a tragedy locked in the past. Decades later, Stanley Milgram's experiments proved how quickly ordinary people surrender their judgment under authority. At Yale, volunteers were told to administer electric shocks to strangers for wrong answers. Despite cries of pain, most kept going when calmly told to continue. These weren't cruel or ignorant people. They were everyday individuals who abandoned conscience when faced with an authoritative voice. Soon after, Solomon Asch showed that social pressure alone could make people doubt what they see. When surrounded by a group giving obviously wrong answers to simple questions, most participants went along at least once. These studies revealed how easily the desire to fit in overrides the evidence of our own eyes. These findings mirrored what Bonhoeffer observed, that people often stop thinking for themselves not out of stupidity, but from the fear of standing alone. When approval feels safer than honesty, slogans replace thought. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest danger to humanity is not the evil of a few, but the indifference of the many." Indifference often begins quietly, with small choices to stay silent or agree with the crowd. Today, we don't need a lab to experience these pressures. Social media platforms flood us with signals about what's acceptable. Every trending post and shared outrage shows what earns approval and what invites isolation. In these spaces, the need to belong often drowns out the courage to question. Milgram and Asch's experiments remind us that moral clarity doesn't vanish in a single dramatic moment. It fades in countless quiet ones as we trade reflection for reassurance. When we stop asking hard questions, we slip into the very surrender Bonhoeffer feared most. What once required a dictator's propaganda machine or a carefully staged experiment now happens quietly, invisibly, through the devices we carry every day. The power of social pressure and authority hasn't vanished. It has been refined by algorithms that know us better than we know ourselves. These systems don't shout commands or threaten punishment. They whisper what we already want to hear, serving up stories, opinions, and facts that feel comfortable and familiar, each click deepening the illusion that we alone see the truth clearly. Not because people consciously love lies, but because misinformation is often more emotionally satisfying, simpler, clearer, more aligned with what we want to believe. The platforms we use are built to keep us engaged, not enlightened. They measure success in minutes watched and links clicked, not in the depth of our understanding or the honesty of our convictions. In this environment, algorithms become quiet shepherds, guiding us deeper into echo chambers we barely realize we've entered. These echo chambers don't just isolate us from ideas that challenge our views. They reinforce our certainty, rewarding us with a rush of validation every time we see our beliefs reflected back to us. Over time, this repetition makes even the most questionable ideas feel obvious and unassailable. It's a process as old as human nature, but never before has it been so relentless or precise. Aristotle once observed, "It is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." Yet how many of us still exercise this discipline when every swipe encourages us to confirm, not question? This subtle manipulation doesn't feel like force. It feels like freedom. The freedom to find communities of like-minded people, to curate news feeds that match our preferences, to mute voices that disrupt our sense of certainty. But real freedom isn't the absence of discomfort. It's the ability to think for ourselves, even when it means grappling with ideas that unsettle us. What looks like liberty can become a soft prison when we're surrounded by comforting lies. In these digital echo chambers, collective certainty grows stronger than individual doubt. Outrage becomes currency. Oversimplification becomes persuasion. And nuance fades until there's no space left for careful thought. The same impulses Milgram and Asch revealed, obedience to authority, conformity to the group, are now triggered by metrics like follower counts and viral trends. We measure the worth of an idea by how many people like it, how often it's shared, how loudly it's repeated. And the more this cycle repeats, the easier it becomes to forget that repetition is not proof of truth. Even more dangerous is how social media turns every one of us into both participant and propagator. Each time we share a sensational post without checking, each time we amplify a claim because it matches our feelings, we become another link in the chain of collective unthinking. Carl Jung's words ring out here. A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them. But in our feeds, we rarely see our own passions clearly. We see only their reflection, magnified and simplified by technology designed to keep us reactive. What these systems exploit is not a flaw of intelligence, but a feature of human psychology. Our brains are wired to notice what confirms what we already believe and to dismiss what contradicts it. Social media doesn't invent these tendencies. It monetizes them. Every pause, every like, every outraged comment becomes data, feeding the algorithm's understanding of what will keep us clicking, scrolling, and coming back for more. The result isn't just individual misinformation. It's a collective momentum toward functional stupidity, a state where we know less than ever, but feel more certain than ever. This certainty, born from endless reinforcement, becomes fertile ground for manipulation. It primes us to accept simplistic explanations for complex problems, to see enemies where there are none, to dismiss evidence without a second glance. It's the same dynamic Bonhoeffer saw in his time, transformed into a digital phenomenon that reaches into every aspect of our lives. And while it may seem invisible, its effects are not. We see them in fractured communities, in rising distrust, in conflicts fueled by half-truths and easy lies. We see them in ourselves, each time we catch the rush of certainty overtaking the slow discipline of thought. Understanding how easily our minds slip into comforting certainty is the first step. But awareness alone won't shield us when the pressure to conform grows overwhelming. Bonhoeffer believed resisting stupidity wasn't a matter of superior intelligence, but a daily commitment to thinking independently, even when it hurt. He called this costly grace because it demands something uncomfortable. The willingness to question what everyone else accepts, to stand apart when standing apart feels lonely, to examine our own beliefs with the same scrutiny we give to others. Practicing intellectual humility is one of the most powerful tools we have. It means recognizing our knowledge is always incomplete, our perspectives always limited, our convictions always worth testing. It's easy to mistake confidence for wisdom, especially when our news feeds reward quick certainty over careful thought. But admitting we don't know and being willing to learn is the essence of true understanding. Socrates insisted, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing," not as an invitation to nihilism, but as a foundation for honest inquiry. Another way to resist intellectual surrender is to intentionally seek out well-argued perspectives that challenge our assumptions. This doesn't mean abandoning our beliefs at the first sign of contradiction, but rather testing them to see whether they stand up to scrutiny. It's like stress testing a bridge. If it collapses under pressure, better to know now than when it's too late. Set aside time each week to read thoughtful work from people who see the world differently, not to confirm they're wrong, but to understand why they think the way they do. Slowing down our reactions is equally essential. Social media thrives on speed, but wisdom grows in stillness. Before sharing an article or opinion, take a moment to check the source, examine the evidence, and reflect on whether the claim is credible. This pause, small as it seems, breaks the cycle algorithms depend on to feed misinformation and emotional outrage. It gives us the chance to act intentionally instead of impulsively, to choose careful thinking over automatic agreement. Another quiet act of resistance is practicing what might seem embarrassingly simple, saying, "I don't know." In a world that prizes quick takes and hot opinions, admitting uncertainty can feel like weakness. But it's the opposite. It's a declaration that we care more about truth than appearances, more about learning than impressing. It signals a mind alive and engaged, not shackled by the illusion of infallibility. Aristotle taught that knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom, and part of knowing ourselves is recognizing where our knowledge ends. But these personal practices aren't enough if the environments we live and work in discourage them. Bonhoeffer saw that entire communities can normalize intellectual surrender, creating a culture where asking questions becomes dangerous, where thinking differently invites suspicion. That's why we need to build spaces, both online and offline, where honest debate is welcome, where disagreements are explored respectfully, where truth is more important than tribal loyalty. These spaces don't happen by accident. They require conscious effort to model humility, to reward curiosity, and to invite complexity. Strengthening our collective resilience also means teaching media literacy at every level of society. We cannot expect people to navigate an ocean of information armed only with instinct. We need programs that help young people and adults recognize reliable sources, question emotional appeals, and evaluate arguments on their merits. This isn't just about fighting fake news. It's about cultivating minds prepared for a world where truth is often buried beneath noise, and wisdom demands patience. Supporting policies that ease the chronic stress so many live under is equally crucial. Bonhoeffer understood that people exhausted by fear, insecurity, or deprivation are more vulnerable to simplistic, comforting lies. When daily survival consumes every thought, there's little energy left to untangle complicated realities. Societies where basic needs are met, where healthcare, housing, and education aren't constant sources of anxiety, give individuals the mental bandwidth to think beyond immediate crises. Cultivating intellectual independence is like strengthening a muscle. It demands regular exercise, deliberate practice, and the willingness to endure discomfort. But over time, it becomes a habit, one that not only protects us from manipulation, but also helps us grow into more honest, compassionate, and courageous human beings. This practice is the antidote Bonhoeffer envisioned, a daily stand against the forces that tempt us to surrender our minds for the fleeting safety of consensus. What Bonhoeffer understood with painful clarity was that the true danger to any society isn't just the loud voices of hatred, but the quiet decision by many to stop thinking for themselves. When people abandon reflection for comfort, when they silence their doubts to fit in, when they let fear or weariness push them into passive agreement, the ground beneath truth begins to crack. And history shows again and again that once enough people choose certainty over curiosity, slogans over evidence, the descent can be swift and the consequences devastating. Yet Bonhoeffer's life is also proof that it doesn't have to end there. Even in the heart of darkness, he chose to keep questioning, to keep speaking, to keep wrestling with what it meant to act justly when everyone else fell silent. His writings from prison remind us that thinking is more than a private exercise. It's a form of resistance, a way to protect not just our own integrity, but the fragile possibility of a society grounded in truth. His courage shows that one person's refusal to surrender their mind can light a path for others, even when the night feels endless. In the world we inherit today, the threats to our independent thought are more subtle but no less powerful. The swirl of constant headlines, the comfort of curated feeds, the ever-present pressure to keep up with everyone else's outrage, all nudge us to react without pausing, to speak without understanding, to believe without investigating. But in every quiet moment we choose to slow down, to check, to listen carefully, we weaken the hold of these forces. Every time we resist the impulse to nod along with the crowd, we reclaim a piece of our freedom. Plato once wrote, "The price good men pay for indifference to public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." Indifference begins when we stop thinking, when we decide it's someone else's job to question, to reflect, to understand. But our hope lies in remembering that the choice to think is always ours, no matter how loud the noise around us grows. By cultivating intellectual humility, by staying curious when certainty tempts us most, by refusing to share what we haven't examined, we become guardians of something greater than ourselves. Because in the end, truth doesn't survive on its own. It depends on people willing to endure the discomfort of complexity, to admit when they're wrong, to stand firm when easy lies swirl around them like a storm. Carl Jung's words echo here. A man who has not confronted the darkness within himself will project it onto the world. When we refuse to examine our own assumptions, we risk becoming exactly what we claim to oppose. But when we do the hard work of thinking honestly, we break the chain of blind conformity before it binds us. So let this be our daily practice. Question what feels obvious. Pause when something rouses quick certainty. And remember that understanding takes time. And let us build communities where disagreement doesn't mean enmity, where conversation goes deeper than headlines, where ideas are tested with respect rather than dismissed with scorn. In these spaces, truth can breathe. In these moments, courage can grow. In these choices, hope can find its foothold. As Bonhoeffer's final days approached, he wrote words that still resonate like a quiet bell in the dark. This is the end. For me, the beginning of life. His commitment to thinking, even at the cost of his own safety, reminds us what's at stake when we choose to keep our minds awake. It's not just about being right, it's about staying human. Because the price of intellectual freedom is eternal vigilance, not against armies or tyrants alone, but against our own longing for the comfortable certainty that can so easily lead us astray. So here's my challenge for you. Pick one belief you hold with unwavering confidence and spend time this week exploring the best arguments against it. Not to weaken your convictions, but to test whether they're strong enough to stand on their own. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If this video challenged you, inspired you, or made you pause and think, leave the word "awake" in the comments below. It's a simple way to remind yourself and each other that in a world pulling us toward easy answers, staying awake to our own thoughts is the first step toward real freedom. And remember, the quiet courage to keep thinking, even when it's inconvenient, might just be the most radical act of hope you can offer. Thank you for being here and choosing to think deeply today.